Welcome back to the Church Law Podcast, where faith, current legal insights, and church leadership come together to equip and empower the body of Christ. I'm your host, Erika Cole, the church attorney, and I'm so honored to share with you today's timely and transformative conversation. So today's episode is titled Bridging the Divide, a conversation on Gracism and the church. And trust me, I know I say this every time, but it's one you're going to want to share with every church leader you know. So my guest today is Dr. David Anderson. He is the founder and president of Gracism Global and the senior pastor of Bridgeway Community Church, one of the most influential multicultural congregations in the nation. With thousands of weekly attendees from more than 60 nations, Dr. Anderson has dedicated his life to bridging deep divides of race, faith, culture, and wealth. Known as the bridge building voice in the nation's capital, he's also the host of the daily radio show Real Talk with Dr. David Anderson, and he's my pastor. Today, we're diving deep into what it means to be a gracist and why racial unity in the church isn't optional, but central to our gospel witness. Dr. Anderson, welcome to the Church Law Podcast.
It's so good to be with you, Erika, and thank you for inviting me to share with you today.
I'm so glad you're here. Well, let's just dive right in. What inspired you to coin the term Gracism? I see the buttons everywhere. I think we've got a coaster here at our house. But this term Gracism, what does it mean and why does it matter in the church?
Well, thank you so much for that. One day I was reading in 1 Corinthians 12, the passage that talks about we're one body with many different parts. And as I began to read through that, it came to me that Paul, the writer of 1 Corinthians, was not simply talking about spiritual gifts, which seems to be the main theme of 1 Corinthians 12, but then he adds this verse in chapter 12, verse 13, where he introduces race, color, class, culture. He talks about Jews and Greeks, slave and free, that's class. And so all of a sudden he introduces into this conversation race, class, and culture. Well, why in the world did you do that, Paul? And if that's the case, then every verse after that, if verse 12:12, he says we're one body with many parts. And in 12:14, he starts breaking down the body parts. The eye can't say to the hand, I don't need you, or whatever it is like that. The hand can't say to the foot, the ear can't say to the eye, all of that he breaks down starting in verse 14. So in 12, he mentions it, and 14, he explains it. But in 13, he actually introduces and slides it right in there to talk about race and culture, which then means, is it possible we should read verses 14 and following through the lenses of what they were dealing with in that church, which was race and culture issues and division within the church? And if so, then how does the rest of the passage feel? And how does it read when you say the eye can't say to the ear, I don't need you? Or the hand can't say to the foot, I don't need you. But now you're thinking color, class, culture, social divisions. Oh my gosh. It then opened up to me in that quiet time that the Lord is talking about issues of racism and classism. And so that's where it began. Then when I thought about racism and I thought about these things that he talks about, 8 principles that he talks about within that passage about honoring one another and about covering one another and about standing together and maybe even grieving with one another or celebrating with one another. When I began to see those principles, I realized that he was trying to upend the isms, the racism, the social issues, the classism within the church's diversity. So unity within all of that diversity, he was upending it by giving us 8 principles to help us overcome it. And those are principles of grace. In fact, he says around verse 7 that a grace and these gifts are given for the common good. And so if it's true then that grace is the way to deal with race and all these other divisions, gracism came to mind because I took the negative word of racism and the positive word and concept of grace. And now I covered racism with grace. And so the
Mm.
G stands for God. And if you put God in front of any problem, he's going to give you the solution to it and the strength to get through it. And so what does it mean? I believe that Gracism is God's solution to racism. So that's where it was born, Erika.
Oh my gosh, that's so, so good. I feel like I learned a lot there. I mean, I've heard this before, but I've never taken it in quite this way. So thanks for explaining that. And I
Hmm.
also just want to say, especially being a mom, I really see how my kids are so accustomed, whether it's in the neighborhood, whether it's at school, wherever, there is this blend of cultures and people. And I see a picture of Dr. King there behind you, presumably
Yeah.
in your office. And I think about a saying that's attributed to him, how Sunday is the most racially divided time, in America. And so I'm curious, like when you consider racial unity, um, why is this so spiritually and theologically important for the church?
Well, the scripture tells us in Ephesians 4:3 that, and it's a command, maintain the unity of the faith through the bond of peace. So if you're maintaining something, that means you have it. And the
Mm,
Lord prayed in John 17, the longest prayer of Jesus recorded in the Bible, that we would be one, that we would be unified, so then that the world would know that God the Father sent Jesus and that we are representatives of him. So we're an answer to God's prayer, to Jesus's prayer in John 17, meaning we have the unity in
mm,
our faith. And so then how do we practice that in our everyday lives? And so he commands us to maintain it, to keep it. It takes work to maintain the unity of the faith, the unity of the spirit, through the bond of peace. And so it's theologically correct, it is biblically correct, but it is practically difficult. And because we've separated ourselves, we no longer look like the first century church when the church began. In Acts chapter 2, when the inauguration of the church, it was multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual, and it was spiritually empowered, right? And then 3,000 people got saved, and it just really counted men. So if you count the men's heads and then you add the wives, you add the children, you add all the guests that came from around the world for that sort of Pentecost holiday, thousands of people came to know the Lord, and that
mm.
was the inauguration of the first century church. Here we are, the 21st century church, and look at how divided we are. What happened? We
Yeah.
allowed the world and other mindsets of division and racism to divide us. And when the world did it, the church followed. And that's the problem. And so when people say, well, why do you have the black church? Well, because the white church didn't let black people in it. Why do you have black colleges and universities? Because, black people weren't allowed in those colleges and universities. Why you got a black woman's beauty pageant? Well, because they weren't allowed in the white. So a lot of what happens in the black community is a response to what they weren't able to get in the broader community. And that's true with other ethnic groups as well, but specifically for blacks because of the origin story of us here in America. So what we have to do then is take God's word, Erika, and apply it today to say, what was God's original intent? And what did God mean when he gave birth to the church? And if we can get back to that, we can see that it is theologically and biblically sound. We now just need principles to activate it in a practical way.
This is so, so good and really helping me see. The more things change, I guess, the more things stay the same when you're really breaking it down and looking at the beginning of the church, right, in the book of Acts, and also seeing how some of those precise same challenges
Yeah,
exist in our church today.
that's right.
So we've talked about the issues and you talked about really how the Bible addresses them. Now, you've often been referred to as a bridge builder. What does that bridge building look like as a practical matter for other church leaders like yourself? So, other pastors, other ministry leaders, or even everyday believers?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Erika. It really is about reaching out to across the divide to other colors, classes, and cultures. And so, if I'm going to be a bridge builder, I can't wait for somebody to build a bridge to me and sit on my side of the bridge and wait for them to come. If I'm
Mhm.
going to be a bridge builder, that means that I'm going to actually move towards someone who's different than I am to build a relationship. So I think it begins there, whether at an individual level or at an organizational level. You know, when we consult companies, organizations, we talk about who's missing in the room, who's on the margins, and how do we go to them instead of expecting them to just come to us? Yes, they need to know that they're welcome, but we also need to walk over to them to build a relationship with them. I remember churches in South Africa that we worked with in the townships a few decades ago, and one of the pastors there that was under our leadership, Pastor Titus, said that, you know, the white churches wanted to serve, so they wanted to send us blankets when it gets cold in the winter around July in South Africa. And it gets pretty cold there. It could be like 50 or 60 degrees, which to us is not that cold, but to them in South Africa, that's pretty cold. And I remember talking to Pastor Titus, and he said that the white church wanted to serve us. And so they said they had blankets for us. And I said, okay, I would love to receive the blankets. Let's get together. To which then the white pastor said, no, we'll send them to you.
Mhm.
And Pastor Titus said, then keep your blankets. I don't want them. Because, see, what Pastor Titus wanted was somebody to walk across the bridge and have a relationship. What that church leader wanted was to send something over to make sure that they get some material goods. And there's a big difference between serving and sending and actually walking across the bridge to relate.
Yeah. In my mind, I'm thinking about the difference between charity, which is wonderful, but connection, which is really, I think, the deeper heart of Christ, right? That we be one, that we be connected. So that goes back to that body element that you talked about. So that's a powerful example. So this kind of leads into the next question that I wanted to pose. How can churches move beyond like performative gestures, like what you just described, right? Sending something, and now in this social media age, showing that you're sending something, showing that you're doing something for another group, right? How do we move beyond like performative gestures toward more of that long-term commitment and dedication, I would say, doing the work of racial healing and justice?
Yeah, so I think those performative gestures come from a good heart, but it still doesn't come from relationship.
Mhm.
And so I think it all begins with relationship. When people ask me, they say, we want to build a multicultural ministry. Because I wrote a book called Multicultural Ministry, Finding Your Church's Unique Rhythm on Zondervan 2004. And people were saying, we want to have a multicultural ministry. And what we would say to them is, you can't have a multicultural ministry until first you become a multicultural minister.
Mm,
And so if you want to build a ministry, you got to first be it. You know, you can't
yeah,
be, an evangelist until you're saved.
yeah,
And so sometimes we want to build something that we're not. And so, if we're going to be authentic, let's build relationships with people first. And then they're going to teach us, show us, and tell us how to build the bridge. Like I always say, evangelism, all you got to do is talk to people. But don't you have to talk to them about Christ? No, you just need to talk to people because they're going to tell you the door to come through when you talk to them. They're going to
mm,
talk about how their marriage is broken. They're going to talk about how their job is stressful. They're going to talk about how their health is failing. They're going to tell you what door to come through. But if you go with the plan, I'm going to share X, Y, and Z, and you're going to listen, well, that's not relationship. That's a sales job. But a relationship says, I want to be with you. I want to hang with you. I want to learn from you. And then when you have that, the philosophy, the strategy, the pathway will present itself. Make
that's
sense?
so good. No, that's really so good. I love, I guess I can say as an observer, right, as someone who is grateful that our family's at Bridgeway. I get to see really the excellence of operations and how Gracism plays out in real life. It doesn't feel like it's made up. It doesn't feel like, well, we're going to sort of, I'm just going to use the term tokenize, any particular group or person. It feels deeply connective, like it's a part of the fabric of the organization. And that's not easy to come by. And I want to just ask you, like, from an organizational standpoint, how how do you advise churches to ensure that their internal operations and their governance structures actually reflect a true commitment to racial unity? Because I think that's something um, in real life, as you were talking about, your book of about being a multicultural church. I think
Yeah.
sometimes what that has often looked like is um, white leadership and then maybe multicultural in the pews or in the chairs or in the theater seating, however it's done,
Yeah.
but not really blended in the operation. So, what would you say to that?
Yeah, Ohio State University did a study on multicultural churches years ago, and they studied the ones across the country. And they got to me, and when the researcher got to me, she said, "I have not seen this across the country in all my research because the churches that were listed as multicultural didn't have someone leading it that looked like you." A younger African American male being in leadership, and every one of the different colors and classes are surrendering or submitting themselves to Black leadership. So it was, like you said, it reflected maybe diversity within the congregation, but not diversity with the staff, with the leadership of the organization, which then we would not define that as multicultural at our outfit here called Gracism Global. So what we try to do is we try to help people understand what is the difference between being multicultural and being multicolored.
Hmm.
Because you see, you have these four quadrants: unicolored, unicultural, multicolored, multicultural. And a lot of churches say they want to be multicultural. Then we take them through an assessment process and they realize, oh my gosh, we didn't want to be multicultural. We wanted to be multicolored, but unicultural, which means many different colors of people in a culture that is one culture. And we want to fit everybody in that one culture. And so that means you don't really want to be multicultural. You want to be multicolored, but unicultural. Now, listen, we're not judging that. If that's what you want to be, at least you're saying it. But you got to know where you are to know where you're going. And then are you willing to pay the price to get to where you think you want to go? Because if you want to be multicultural, now we want to help you think through what that looks like at an authentic level, what that costs at an authentic relational level, and what that means for your organization. Once you see that, you may say, you know what, I'm down with that. Or you may say, you know what, that's too much for us here. Maybe we ought to plant a church, or maybe we ought to partner, strategize with another church, but trying to transition this one to that would cost us too much. And so, at an organizational level, I think consulting from a group like ours, Gracism Global, you can find us online, gracismglobal.com. We can actually help you walk through that to figure out what does it look like organizationally. Now, the churches and organizations, Christian organizations, NGOs, even governments, when they have taken the eight sayings or principles or standards of Gracism and have applied it to their organization, they have been able to see organically how this can be more than just an organization, it can be an organism that is now living out Gracism. And if we think about it like that, it's so very helpful as just looking at the different colors of people and palettes of people. How do we take the organization and make it live like an organism of Gracism? And hopefully, Arika, that's what you are experiencing when you're a part of our body.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I know that that is something that our listeners would also love to experience. So we will make a point to leave all of the Gracism Global information in the show notes as well. I'm going to have to wrap up, even though this has been such an amazing conversation. Let me
Mhm.
just ask you this final question. You have traveled. How many nations do you even know? How many nations you've been to?
Yeah, I think it's been about 50 or so.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you've been to 50 or so nations and you have seen how church is done, um, from Asian countries to African nations to, I'm sure many states around the US, etc. What would you say is your vision for the future of the church, globally and in the US, when it comes to what we've been discussing, this lens of Gracism?
Yeah, thank you for that. I just came from Pakistan where it's 97% Muslim. And while I was there, certain people heard that I was in the country. And so within 24 hours, I was invited to speak 2 days later as a closing speaker for the eighth annual World Conference on Religions, and I
Wow.
was speaking to 97% Muslims, and I was the speaker representing Christianity, and I shared Gracism. And while hundreds of people heard that, the feedback I received was how foundational the change and the shift was for them, because the country of Pakistan had never heard Christianity being reflected and represented by someone who looked like me.
Wow.
All of their history, when they heard of Christianity, that came from outside of Pakistan, it was white missionaries. And so they never even had a speaker who looked like me that could then verbalize what unity among religions and among classes and cultures, with me being a representative of the Lord Jesus Christ, even looked like. And so when you ask what my vision would be, it would be that Christian people who reflect who Jesus Christ is are bringing their whole selves together across classes and cultures and even other religions. And interestingly enough, it was Dr. Martin Luther King. And I know you saw his picture. It's not big enough for you to see that there is a letter that's written from him to my father, Reverend Anderson, signed on his letterhead with Southern Christian Leadership Board in the letterhead, and him signing it in blue
Wow.
pen directly from him to my father. And one of the things that he said is what you quoted, Erika, earlier in the broadcast and podcast. You said that, 11 a.m., he's popularized this statement on Sunday mornings, is the most segregated hour of the week. What is my vision? That one day that would be reversed, that 11 a.m. on Sunday mornings would be the most inclusive and integrated hour of the week, because of the powerful blood of Christ that takes us back to what he already declared. And that is that we have unity in him. We just have to maintain it, keep it, and actualize it through our practical lives.
I love that so much. Wow, that's so powerful. So you are really carrying this mantle, obviously from God Himself, but also it's beautiful to see from your own father and his pastoral role. So that's just really awesome to see and to hear. As we wrap up, are there any final words that you want to share, and then we'll sign off shortly.
My final quote would be this: comprehension begins with conversation. There's an old African proverb that says, "From afar, I thought he was a monster. When he got closer, I thought he was an animal. When he got closer, I realized he was a human being. But when we were face to face, I realized he was my brother." See, distance demonizes. Those people, they're monsters, or they're animals, or maybe they're humans, but they're not close to me. Distance demonizes. But when you're face to face, you realize that comprehension begins with conversation. So as long as we use difference as a doorway for dialogue and have conversation, we'll begin to see how much we have in common, and we'll be able not to demonize one another for the things that we don't have in common. If we do that, I think we can be like the Lord, who is the biggest gracist of us all,
Yeah.
because he left his race. He went to a completely different race of people, a different species of people, and he built a bridge of love. And if he can do
Amen.
that, I want to be like him. He's the biggest gracist of us all. So that's who I look to so I can be one as well.
That's so awesome. That's so powerful. What a powerful and much needed conversation. I just want to thank you again, Dr. Anderson, for sharing your wisdom, your experience, your heart for racial unity in the church. That is so central to, I think, what is needed today, perhaps more than any time.
Yeah.
Um, Thank you for your work through Gracism Global. That continues to challenge and inspire leaders around the world to lead with courage, compassion, and conviction. I would encourage listeners to stay up to date with what's happening in the law and leadership on in the church community by joining the Church Attorney newsletter. All that information will be below. And it's a great way for us to stay in touch between episodes. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. Please, listeners, just note that all of the information related to Gracism Global is in the show notes, so check that out. We'll also have information on this podcast episode at eurekacole.com. Thank you so much again, Dr. Anderson. Blessings to
So
you.
good to be with you. Thanks for inviting me,
All
Erika.
right. God bless.